Hi. As we continue today in Luke 11, starting in verse 33, it can seem like this chapter is a mixture of a whole bunch of different things, starting with the Lord's Prayer, and then telling the story about the friend at midnight with the neighbor who will not give him bread, and then a question about Beelzebul, and then a question about signs, and now we're talking about eyes and lights and bodies. But as I was trying to say at the beginning of this sequence, there really is a thread that holds us all together, and it's the question of prayer. So it began with Jesus praying and teaching the Lord's Prayer, and as we've seen, one of the first questions, as we see on the right side of the screen in the blue boxes, is, does God really care about and or listen to someone like me? And so the lesson there was, as Jesus says, everyone is called to ask and God and to seek and to knock at the door. So everyone is included, nobody is excluded. And then the next question was, how do you know it's the voice of God? And so we went through the Beelzebul controversy, and Jesus made clear that the God that he is praying to gathers people together into one, and Beelzebul and Satan, different names for the same reality, tear things apart and are at war. And so once we're clear then of which voice is the voice of God, the question is, where do we turn for protection? And so we saw that in the story of the castle and the strong man and the stronger man. And so then we looked on the pink side here for those who refuse to pray and refuse to listen. What the wisdom literature and texts like the book Wisdom of Solomon or Sirach often refer to as the ungodly, which is to say, if the God of Israel, Yahweh, is the one true God, then if you don't believe in that God, you're not an atheist, as we might say in our modern world, but you're simply ungodly. Many of the people who texts like Sirach would describe as ungodly don't think of themselves as atheists. They think they believe in the gods of whatever empire they're being loyal to. But the point from the Bible's perspective is those gods don't exist. And so by default one becomes an atheist in the sense of not choosing to believe there's no God, but not believing in the one true God. And so people who absolutely refuse to pray or listen face the kind of collective judgment that we saw with the rising up of the Queen of the South and the sign of Jonah. But now it turns back to those who are praying. And the question here, as we've been seeing throughout the travel narrative, right from the very beginning, and we'll see it multiple times because it needs to be said multiple times, is this requires total commitment. That if someone claims to follow Jesus and prays sometimes and then listens to advertising other times and listens to the voices of other people other times, it can get very confusing, and in the language of our passage today, some of your light gets mixed with darkness. And so that's the theme we're looking at today, which will apply itself all the way into Acts of the Apostles and stories like Ananias and Sapphira and the challenge of being all in economically there. When we've been following in our journey to Jerusalem chiasm, we might note that our particular verses here, 11:33 to 36, are not listed in this chiasm, which, as my note below, came from Kenneth Bailey's book that we've been looking at in this section as well. That's simply because this theme is not replicated on the other side, and yet we've been noting this is kind of a loose chiasm, although in our last scene we noted that the sign of Jonah in the current passage in chapter 11 is definitely parallel to the question of Noah in chapter 17. There certainly are chiastic parallels. Our little passage here is not really one of those links, though. But when we look at key words here in our passage, we see plainly the key word theme is light. Both light itself and the related word full of light, contrasted with evil there. So let's see how this passage fits not only with Mark and Matthew, but with an earlier passage in Luke, because we saw almost this identical passage back in chapter 8, as you can see on the right side of the screen. So in this color-coded tripart chart here, you can see that Mark's words are in the original color here of red, and then the parts of Mark that are in Matthew, just this much, are there, and the parts of Mark that are in Luke, just those little pieces. Then there's the part that is unique to Matthew, which is the purple, and that's all of this, and the parts that are unique to Luke are all the blue. So as we saw last time, that Luke had taken the story, Mark's story of the burglar and the question of the binding the strong man, and turned it into a story defending a castle, and really changed the story around. Here it's also a different story, and is always in a different place. But this is just for the first version of it that we looked at already in chapter 8. Now we see that both Luke and Matthew have a replication, although Matthew's is not really a replication. Matthew has paralleling with what we have here, the green parts here, but Matthew in chapter 6 is not repeating what Matthew had just said earlier in chapter 5. Both of these in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's Gospel. Whereas for Luke, what we saw in chapter 8 was before the journey to Jerusalem began, and now we have it in a different context. And even Luke doesn't repeat it exactly. We have the issue of lighting a lamp, but here it was a question of putting it under a jar. Here it's a matter of putting it in the cellar. Both of those are, of course, wrong. The right answer is on a lampstand for everyone to see, and that's true in both situations. But in the earlier situation, paralleling Mark, the question is not whether the disciples or Jesus' followers are focused on him. The question is what is hidden will be revealed. Nothing is hidden except to be disclosed in both Mark and Luke. So in the repetition of the image of bringing up the light, it's not about revealing things that are hidden. It's about discerning what's going on inside one's own body. So with that in mind, let's look more closely at our passage. And as always, there's some translation issues, because you can see here what I have is it translated as your eye is single, whereas the New Revised Standard, like many have, is your eye is healthy, which is incredibly misleading. But let's look at the details. So no one, after lighting a lamp, puts it in a cellar, I guess, unless you need to get around in the cellar, but that's another story. The word isn't really cellar, though. The word is krypton, which simply means a secret place. It's only here in the New Testament. As Marshall suggests, since a cellar is the very place where a light would be required, it seems like that's not a great interpretation. Although, as my note below continues, Luke may be contrasting a private revelation, light in the cellar, with community preaching, light for all to see. If we want to see this as at least partially allegorical, and it may be about the group's light, although that doesn't seem to be exactly what's going on here, but it could be read either way. So you put it on the lampstand, of course, which would be a menorah in the Jewish tradition, a 7-candle lampstand, so that those who enter may see the light, and that presumably is including entering a room, not entering a secret place. So far, so good. We already know that, and we've heard that before. But now it shifts to your eye. Your eye is the lamp of the body. And we've seen body many times here, and the body can be physical or metaphorical. Here it's plainly physical, as the eye is part of your physical body. And as Green notes below, playing on both the ancient sense of vision functioning by allowing light out of one's body and the medical/ethical double entendre of the evil or unhealthy eye, which is what we see here. Because the contrast is, if your eye is single, hoplos, which is also in Matthew's parallel, but it is not healthy, which is poneros, which is evil. So the issue isn't biological health. The issue is a spiritual focus. Either the eye is single, meaning focused completely on God and the gospel and Jesus, or it's evil, focused on Beelzebul or Satan or the other. And it might seem dichotomous, but Luke is very aware of there can be a mixture, and we'll see that in just a moment. But there certainly is a choice between the one way and the other way, and that's what we've been seeing throughout this entire chapter, and really throughout the whole gospel. So when you hear the term evil eye here, I'm not sure what that brings up in you, but for the ancient world, that was a major factor in how people behaved. And no one has done more for this, and no one could probably do more than this, than John Eliot, who's written a 4-volume series on the evil eye in the ancient world, almost 1,600 pages on the cultural context of the evil eye. And I must confess, I have not read these 4 books, but one of them is on the evil eye in the Bible. And at least the superficial conclusion that we can draw from that, without getting into all the enormous body of evidence he has, is that across many cultures there is certainly considered a power that if you could look at someone with evil, you could cause harm to them. That it wasn't just as we might think, that someone's giving somebody side eye or a bad look, that there was actually power in that. So in the same way that when someone can look at somebody with good light and make them feel better, not only would you make someone feel bad, but you could actually cause harm to them. And if you'd like to know more, you're not going to find a better source than John Eliot. But what about your whole body is full of light? As Green notes there, many scholars have noted the ancient, what we would call a misunderstanding, that the mechanism of human sight happens by light literally going into the body and then projecting out, like the light from a lamp, so we can see it. And we can become arrogant if we like and say, well, we know that's not how it works, and talk about lenses and refraction and all those things. But I'm sure if my wife Sue, who's a spiritual director and a prayerful mystic, who sees people in their light when they're in prayer, would disagree. and highlight that although science can teach us some things, there are some things that science can't teach us, and some things we can see only with the eye of prayer and faith, which is exactly what Jesus is about. So we recall the transfiguration. Jesus was so lit up that they could barely look at him, as you can see from the verse here. And so that's what's being referred to. It's a sense of people actually being filled with the light of God, not the photons that we see outside, but the light of God. And if you recall Genesis 1, that the light that's in the beginning when God says, "Let there be light," is not sunlight, because the sun isn't made till the fourth day. So right from the beginning, the Bible suggests that yes, there's the physical light of the sun, and of course that's what lights up the day, but there's also God's light, which is something else. And we know, whether you're a person of faith or you're talking in a faith context or not, don't we all know when we look in people's eyes that when they're in a good spirit, when they are full of joy, their eyes and whole face are lit up. And when they're depressed or sad, they look dark and down. And so some of that's metaphorical perhaps, but some of it's not. We can certainly all see when someone's eyes are full of light, even if we know that doesn't mean there are more photons in them. So we can let our experience teach us, as well as the logic that we know from scientific discovery. So the contrast is plain. If your eye is single, if you're focused plainly on what Jesus is about and God, then you're full of light. But if it's evil, if your eye is evil, in other words, if you're among these people over here, then your body is full of darkness. And then we also recall that would echo the various elements of blind people leading other blind people into the pit. So now it continues with a consideration here as our little scene ends. Therefore, consider, or literally watch out, which is to say a verb that relates to seeing, to watch. As Fitzmyer suggests there, Luke has made the more original exclamation preserved in Matthew 6:23, which you can see here, into a warning which builds on the saying. So in Matthew we had, so if your eye is single, your whole body will be full of light, but if your eye is evil, your whole body will be full of darkness, in prediction in the future. But in Luke, it's your whole body is full of darkness, so he makes it into present tense there. And then here's the part that could be confusing, apart from what I hope was the explanation at the beginning here that's offered. Verse 36 is obviously not part of what Matthew has. So as Garrett reads this as eschatological, which is to say about the end times or the judgment we saw in the previous scene. It presents a real quote-unquote future where the light will be revealed, as in Paul's Damascus Road experience, which is of course reported in Acts of the Apostles, the other half of Luke's writing. So Luke is certainly going to narrate a situation where someone experiences that light and is filled with it. So, if then your whole body is full of light, using this word photinon twice in the verse, with no part of it in darkness, so you're 100% in, it will be as full of light as when a lamp gives you light with its rays, or literally its beam, astrope, the same word used for lightning back in 10:18, when Jesus said he saw Satan falling like lightning. And we'll see it again in chapter 17. It's certainly common in the book of Revelation. So you will be filled with that light with no part of it in darkness. And that brings back the question of what could mean the light in you is not darkness? How could the light in you be darkness? Which is to say that what it is you're trying to see by, what enables you to go out into the world and make choices and live your life, is not the darkness of the religion of empire, of the call of Satan, of the Roman Empire in particular, which would divide up into categories of high and low and in and out. Exactly what Jesus' light is trying to help people to see is united in the reality of God's creation, where all are one. And so after this, chapter 11 will continue for the first time with specific opponents, where a Pharisee, for the second time, not the same Pharisee, but a second time a Pharisee, is invited Jesus to dine with him, and we'll see what unfolds there. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.